Hey gang, today we're going to talk about iOS design patterns. Now iOS is different than Android, and iOS is different than Mac, and iOS is different than Windows. And designing for a handheld device is different than designing for a website, and we're going to really embrace that in the stuff that we're going to look at today. In order to really understand where iOS is, it's helpful to understand where iOS has come from. And so what we're going to do is first just consider the fact that many moons ago, iPhone 1 came out, and it was this big, chunky, clunky device. And as we move through time, we got these sleek, larger screen, zero-touch interfaces. And it's important to remember that it just wasn't birthed that way, that stuff over time has evolved and iterated and grown to be the diverse ecosystem that we see today, filled with really advanced hardware and really interesting things that we can do with it. You know, this device here on the left is very different than the one on the right. The one on the left had very slow internet connection, very limited functionality, versus the one on the right is basically a supercomputer in your pocket. One of the many important milestones in iOS really is iOS 7. iOS 7 was this huge breaking point from what was to what is today. iOS 7 turned away from what we call skeuomorphic design. In other words, individual apps were not designed to look like physical real-world objects. Instead, everything embraced what at the time was described as flat design. Well, as we'll get into and see today, it's really not flat, it's just flattener. That really embraces bright, bold colors and that sort of thing. And so really it makes sense that before iOS 7, everything did look like real-world objects because it was novel and new, and people were uncomfortable with it. And so by making it look like physical real-world objects, that natural mapping made people more comfortable using the newer tools. However, as the ecosystem evolved, that was no longer needed. And iOS 7 really embraced the digitalness of iPhone. At the heart of all interface design, especially mobile, is understanding this true fact, that input defines interface. Let me say that again. Input defines interface. What we mean by this is that back in the day when it was just punch cards, that input device, of a card with holes punched into it, defined the interface of the device. As we fast forward to more contemporary computing like laptops and desktops, mice and keyboard defined interface, meaning you can get really precise with a mouse down to the pixel perfect location of that pointer. But the second that you introduce touch, now you have to worry about big fat fingers, and those things are way less precise than a pointer. Input defines interface is crucial to understand because it really will change how you approach your design, leaving room for the constraints of the interface of the input device and embracing the specific characteristics that the input device can bring. And so to that end, let's look at what the input in iPhone is. Up until iPhone 10, the input device was a hardware button. There's also still remaining hardware buttons for volume, for up and down, toggling, ringer, and hiding display. It should be noted that the volume controls can also be used for camera controls. So those can be used to control shutter in the camera as well. At the heart, though, besides these hardware elements, at the heart of iOS and all mobile computing platforms that we're going to look at is touch. Touch is crucial. Think about what touch means from an interface design standpoint. In the old days, if you moved your cursor using a mouse, the cursor was a visual manifestation of your intent. As I move my hand, it moves the cursor accordingly on screen. However, that barrier to interaction has been removed. And so now, touch, you physically are the interface. You're touching glass. I like to say you're pantomiming on the surface of glass what you intend to do. But besides the fact that these mobile devices are now in our pockets, this touch-driven interface is incredibly intimate. And understanding that really will help you understand what you need to do with iPhone. Because it's not just intimate in how it's touched, it's intimate as in it's a device that's always on you in your pocket. It's intimate in the sense that you're the only one that sees the screen. It's an incredibly intimate device. And recognizing that will allow you to come up with some really new and innovative solutions to old problems. So we're in iOS, the newest versions. What are some things that drive iOS? You know, both in iOS 7 and iteratively since, actually going back way before iOS, going all the way back to the Mac days in the 80s, the thing that drove the interface was the design language. And Apple publishes these design languages. It's called the Human Interface Guidelines. In many ways, the Human Interface Guidelines are the cornerstone upon which we need to build. They shouldn't be viewed as something that constrains you. They should be viewed as simply a launching pad for your ideas, not a box that you have to operate inside of. If you operate like they're like a box that you have to operate inside of, all of your design will just be standard, it will be vanilla, it will be look like every other tool out there. However, if you see these as a starting point that you build upon, you'll be able to come up with some new and innovative design solutions. You know, if you listen to I've introduced iPhone 7 or iOS 7, you hear a handful of different ideas. And these handful of different ideas are repeated over and over again in the Human Interface Guidelines. And they're worth calling attention to because in my mind, they're what separates iOS from other mobile platforming systems, is this approach, thinking about these three things as primary. And they are deference to the content. In other words, the idea is that the interface recedes so the primary content that the user cares about can elevate to the surface and becomes the primary thing that they see and interact with. In every opportunity that you can in iOS, you should be thinking, any case that you can, to make the information the interface. Is there a way to make it so that the content becomes a thing that people interact with directly rather than having buttons and overlays and things and modes that get in the way? Can I make it so that the touch, the intimate human touch, can be directly on the thing that the user cares about versus some abstract thing that's layered on top? Deference to the content is the primary big idea. Next is clarity. Clarity into what something is. And clarity, in my mind, always means add detail. So clarity to understand exactly what's happening and to push away and push aside all the extra noise. When iOS 7 was introduced, you can hear I've talk about how they're kind of embracing the digital nature of the operating system rather than trying to mimic the real world through natural mapping and through skeuomorphic design. They're trying to increase clarity of just the content, just the ideas, and that sort of thing. And finally, a sense of depth in space. Now, you're not going to see in iOS a lot of shadows. People say that means it's flat design. That's not correct. It's not flat design. It really is very spatial. It's just not mapped to the real world in the same way that it used to be. Instead, we're going to see a sense of depth moving through space, both in and out of apps and in and out of screens, and left to right within screens, and up and down within screens. That depth, that X, Y, and Z movement is really, really emphasized in iOS in very specific ways. And understanding how those specific ways are implemented will help you design something that feels and looks like it belongs within this ecosystem, all the while surprising and delighting your users. So let's look at each one of those things. Deference. This is a recording of the Photos app in iOS, and you can see that the content is primary. The photos themselves are the primary interface elements. If you want to load an image, you just tap on the image. There's no button that says, let me see this image. The image itself is a button. And then there's padding around the buttons, and they're just nothing. They're just black, or white rather. And then you can tap and zoom in on individual images and gesture on top of the glass. Even when you do things like this, like editing what you want the image to look like, the image is the primary thing. All the administrative debris of editing these things and adjusting things recedes visually so that the image itself becomes the primary element. Next, clarity. This is the Music app, and here you can see the information I care about, the albums themselves and the tracks within them, are the most primary thing. There's not a lot of extra noise, not a lot of visual stuff. You can see that the work itself becomes primary. And so it's simple things as playing the lyrics to the song while the song is playing perfectly in sync with the song is an example of clarity. It's allowing people to really embrace the work itself, embrace the piece that they care about. These lyrics can be hidden, and when they're hide, they just simply disappear. There's no smaller version or anything like that. They just tuck away. And elements move and animate through space to just reinforce clarity. This big thing you were looking at has now been tucked down here. And finally, a sense of space and depth. When we launch apps, we literally move into them, into their space. And as we can see here, as I'm navigating through the calendar app, I'm moving into individual days, and then once I'm on an individual day, I move left and right within elements on that day. There's a very clear sense of moving through space as you interact with these elements. I should say this because it's a common mistake. Hamburger menus, you see them everywhere. In Android, they're called the drawer. In iOS, they do not belong. In iOS, they are not a thing. That junk drawer attitude of design is not a thing that exists in iOS. If you have to use it, do so very sparingly and as a last resort. Instead, let's talk about the individual elements of iOS, and we're going to start with navigation. Easily the most important part of any interaction design is understanding how the navigational system works. Along the top of all iOS, we have what's called the navigation bar. The navigation bar here, you can see, can come in a handful of different flavors. Once you move into a page, the previous page appears in the top left with a label saying if you touch the top left back button, it will return you, in this example, to settings. Also in this bar, we'll replace with simply the label of that element. So if I'm in my inbox as an email, like we're looking at here in the center, you can say it says inbox. And on the right, edit. Once I go into an individual email, that area gets replaced with an arrow that says all inboxes, as well as some navigational elements that move from one element to the next within that page. So it allows me to move from one email to the next email to the previous email, etc. And so it just basically swipes through content. Do not use this top bar for global navigation. This navigation bar is for moving within an element that the user has selected. Instead, for global navigation, we use tabs. Tabs are located at the parts at the bottom of the screen, and there's usually 4 or 5 of them, rarely to exceed 5 elements along the bottom. They follow a very consistent visual language that we'll look at more in the future, and you can see that the one that you're on is highlighted. I should point this out because this is a big pet peeve of mine. You'll see that tabs have icons as well as text. Remember to clarify, add detail. Never rely on your glyph or your symbol to carry the weight that the English language can. Instead, make sure you have labels underneath all of your symbols. These buttons are on the bottom. These tabs can be used in a handful of different ways. Typically the way we just looked at, which is a global navigational element that lets you jump between major sections of your tool. However, sometimes there are also primary calls to action, such as the Instagram app, where you have a set of 5 elements, and the middle one is a special one. In Instagram, that's make a new entry, but you can do some other things with L. Calls to action, to be frank, are a little weak in iOS. It's not as clear as it is in Android. There's a lot of options. So, you can have something like this as a global call to action. You can also do things like this. This is the Twitter app. In the top right, you can see there's the call to action to create a new tweet. It's very subtle. Other calls to action, such as here in the new Messages app, are highly contextual. So you can see that someone has written the word Kirk in the right-hand screen into the text box, and the send button is adjacent to that text box. By making these call to action adjacent to the action that you're taking, it just reinforces this little text box you just typed into, you're about to send it. That's an important thing. Is by attaching the call to action to a specific action, just reinforces this is the thing that you're applying it to. Additionally, you'll find in the human interface guidelines for how buttons are treated. You can see here, buttons have a small border around them, and there's 2 different variants of buttons. There's normal case and capital case. Capital case should be reserved for special buttons that you will call a lot of attention to, or buttons that will trigger major disastrous results if you tap them on accident. Other interface elements within iOS are segmented controls. They're these little pill type things. Here you can see that there's library and playlists. They're used to toggle between things within a local page. They're not global navigation. They're not even local navigation, which is what the navigation control is for. They are for controlling individual things that are on the page you're on. If you're used to Android, you probably use segment controls to do local navigation. That is not how it's done in iOS. Instead, these segment controls are things just to control and toggle settings within a given page. Often in iOS, you're going to call up what they call the share sheet or the action sheet. It's a little upward-facing button that can trigger this sort of thing. These are to be used as kind of advanced controls. You can think of these as almost like quick keys on a keyboard for a pro-level app. It's something you shouldn't necessarily rely on users needing to use very often. This is special functionality. Let's move on to some other visual elements more broadly within iOS. Specifically, everything falls on an 8 digital pixel grid. So things are intentionally designed larger than they are in desktop. That's so that touch can be involved. And so you see that touch targets should never be smaller than 44 digital pixels. Anything smaller than that can be easily missed by a finger tap. Also, in visual elements, you'll see the use of color. It's a typo, I should say color. Color, you can see color is really embraced in iOS, very bright, vibrant, positive colors. So for instance, on the right-hand side is the definitions of each individual kind of generic color in iOS. And you can see things just as simple as blue and red, we would normally think as being full-on 100% versions of blue with no green, no red. No, there is subtlety in these colors. It's worth pointing out they're not these garish, harsh colors that you would normally expect with things like blue, quote-unquote, and red, quote-unquote. You can see that there is some subtlety in there, but they just really embrace the vibrancy. I should also point out on this screen we see an example of new functionality that's going to be rolling out probably around October in iOS 14. This is integrating widgets into the home screen. There's a lot of that kind of stuff that's happening across iOS 14. And if you're not familiar with what's happening in that space, you really should check it out, specifically the WWDC videos from summer 2020 will help give you a sense of what's coming next in iOS 14. Other visual elements are cards. Cards are like cards that you play in cards. Small little things that fly up on top of the interface. This is an example from the Maps app, and you can see that Facebook HQ down there is a card. It's indicated by a little bar across the top that indicates the user can touch and drag that up. And it's a place where additional information is tucked around something that's on this page. You can see this user has highlighted the Facebook HQ. Inside of that, you might find the phone number, the specific address, etc. on that card. However, all that information is tucked down off the screen and only needed when it's needed. Again, this is an example of deference. You're deferring all that administrative debris to the most important thing to the user, which is the map of what they're trying to get to. Typography. The baseline typography used in iOS is San Francisco and New York. These are custom fonts that have been designed by Apple for these devices. In fact, you'll see that San Francisco and New York are actually used across the gamut of Apple products. So Mac OS, Watch OS, TV OS, iOS, and iPad OS all use these typography solutions. You can download these fonts from Apple's development website. Additionally, not only a font, but this is actually pretty cool, one of the things that Apple has published is a set of symbols that they call San Francisco symbols. These symbols are designed to work really well with the San Francisco font. In the same way that the letter A would be carefully crafted for San Francisco to match that font, these symbols have been carefully crafted to match that font as well. And so things like line width and spacing and how open different shapes are both reflected in the typographic solution as well as the symbols. There are over 750 symbols in the newest version of iOS that will be rolling out in October. You can find all those inside of Apple's development website, as well as an app that will help you find them. But I would encourage you to check them out, and whenever possible, save a little bit of time and use them as a starting point. Motion is crucial in iOS. Static screens that are just like comic book panels will not work. When we design things, we need to think about the space, the time in between screens. So we've already looked at some examples of motion like moving through the calendar app, but there's lots of other motion that are all triggered by gestures. And the idea is that this is a living, breathing surface that as you touch it, it instantly reacts to what you're doing. And the animation there reflects and reinforces the gesture that the user is engaging in. Next, we have generic pickers. There's a lot of update to pickers in iOS 14. The date picker is probably one of the largest examples. But other types of pickers, are things where you tap on something and it opens something up. Let you pick a date, let you pick from drop-down lists, that sort of thing. You can also see here what toggle switches are supposed to look like and that sort of thing. Next steps. Really understanding iOS, this is just a surface view, really understanding it really will behoove you to spend a lot of time in the human interface guidelines. And so that's where I'd like you to head next. Jump into those human interface guidelines, really understand what Apple is expecting of you and what they expect of the platform. Again, let me just reinforce this. As you read them, it's really easy to kind of perceive them and feel them as like boxes that block you in and make it so that you can't do anything interesting from a design standpoint. That's not their intent, nor what I expect you to do. You should instead think of these as a launching pad, a starting point, a visual language that you can build upon rather than one that constrains you. That's all I have about iOS. Hopefully help understand what is there. If you're somebody that isn't familiar with iOS, you're going to want to definitely spend a lot of extra time in this section. And then when we move on to Android, those of you that are iOS users will need to spend more time there.